Hello and welcome. I'm Kathy Blee. I'm the co-director of the Collaboratory Against Hate, and on behalf also of Lori Craner, the other co-director of the Collaboratory, I want to welcome you to our final talk in the Collaboratory's speaker series for this academic year. This talk, by the way, that we have people here on the web, but there's also people on the live stream, and we are recording this. So if you know people who are interested in viewing the recording later or using it in the class, watch for the newsletter and the links will be available. So it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Kathleen Carley, who's a professor in the School of Computer Science at CMU. She's also director of the Center for Computational Analysis of Social and Organizational Systems, a university-wide interdisciplinary center that brings together network analysis, computer science, and organizational science. And she's also the director of the Center for Informed Democracy and Social Cybersecurity, the IDEA Center. Kathleen's many publications combine cognitive science, social networks, and computer science to address complex social and organizational problems, including those of hate. She's on the steering committee of the Collaboratory Against Hate, and she's co-chairing the Collaboratory's research working group on understanding and countering hate through computational analysis, along with Professor Yu Ru Lin of the University of Pittsburgh. So let me welcome Kathleen, who's speaking to us today on the Nexus of Harm. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and as time allows, Kathleen will answer them after her talk. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Kathleen, and thank you, Lori, also for having me and for setting up this seminar series. So I'm going to talk to you about the work that I'm going to talk to you about comes from work that I and my group have been doing for a number of years under a variety of different kind of around a number of different kinds of issues, but all related to what I call the nexus of harm. When we think about what I mean by that, I mean that online, what we see happening is that people are spreading disinformation. That disinformation is sometimes used as a basis for promoting and creating extremists or for building extremism. And all of those groups then go off and sometimes promote that information through hate speech. So what we see online is that there's this kind of nexus where hate, disinformation, and extremism come together. And when those three things come together, we often see offline behaviors that are, basically violent often, and at the least kind of involve civil protests. But usually they become much more violent than that. In trying to understand hate, disinformation, extremism, my group has developed actually this entire pipeline. And we actually collect data from, originally it was just Twitter, but now we also have it from Reddit and from LinkedIn and a number of other sources. We collect the data, then we run through computational linguistics to get at things like emotional cues that are in the texts, various information on sentiment, and various other kinds of information by looking at the content of the messages. We have a whole bunch of machine learning tools, such as the ability to detect bots or trolls, to detect hate speech, location, the stance of actors, and so on. And then we bring it all together in a network visualization. My point is that in order to understand and look at hate speech, extremism, and disinformation, there's a whole bunch of technology you even need that you need to bring together in order to begin to ferret out what is actually going on online. And you need a deep understanding of the online space. Now, what we've discovered throughout all of this work is that social media, regardless of platform, is actually organized into what we call topic groups or topic-oriented communities. These are clusters of individuals who are talking to each other about the same topic. So they're more or less connected to each other, more or less on the same topic. But these groups can become pathological, and their pathological form is the echo chamber, where the groups are extremely highly connected and they are extremely talking on the same topic. Now, echo chambers in part are dangerous because once you get an echo chamber online, the other people who are listening to them don't necessarily realize that they are an echo chamber. So, for example, in this image here, we've got Indy and Phryne, both are getting information from an echo chamber, which you see as this basic sphere up at the top. But, you know, that all they see is Cindy or Jillian or Crystal, and they don't realize, they have no way of knowing that, in fact, the information they're getting from all those people is actually coming from a group that is not only that is very highly connected and is actually an echo chamber. What they are seeing instead is social consensus. Gee, everybody seems to agree. And that's one of the reasons this pathological form is very dangerous online. It's also the case that as groups become more and more like echo chambers, they start to lose objectivity when talking about things. They focus more on stories and shared stories rather than on facts. They develop a sense of sharing and belonging and a feeling that those others who they're talking to really understand themselves. So it can be a very positive thing for those who are members of those echo chambers. They also develop suspicion to newcomers, and they tend to engage in rapid interaction. Their language actually tends to also decrease, and they become prone to something called amygdala hijack. Now, the amygdala an amygdala hijack is something that happens when there's an emotional overload, right? You're just emotionally overwrought so that you stop thinking about things rationally, instead just start responding to things emotionally. Your emotions can be hijacked like this through various things that you see happening, through various speeches that other makes, through events. Every one of us has actually felt and been in this kind of situation. For example, maybe you've gone to your favorite sports team and they won and you're all excited, and afterwards, and you do something really, and you end up doing something really stupid. Okay. That's because you had this amygdala hijack that got there because you got so excited by what went on at the sports game. But amygdala hijacks, once you're kind of in this emotional thing, are things that only last for a short period of time. And they're very hard to sustain. And you will often rapidly go away from them because you'll just kind of wear out. So what's going on online is that people are forming these echo chambers, then they're exciting them. So they start behaving very, with this kind of more emotionally than rationally. Then they'll go off and do something in the offline or the real world, and then they will calm down again. So that's an example of that's the pattern that we've seen happening again and again and again online, where you're getting a link to offline behavior. There's several different things that are in influence campaigns as we're trying to form these echo chambers. One is that tricks are being played that exploit the technologies themselves, that exploit the way in which Reddit or Twitter or Facebook prioritizes messages, that exploit the way they recommend individuals to each other, and so on. So the messages that you send in social media actually have an impact on others, not just because of what you write, but because of what they cause the social media platforms to do to other people. The other thing that your messages can do is they exploit the mind or the cognitive biases of people. Many of the messages we see that are meant to actually increase hatred or increase extremism actually are exploiting people's confirmation bias or their escalation commitment or their fear or flight reflex. We also find that the messages that are engaged and that are useful or cause these kinds of extreme behaviors to occur are exploiting people's worldview. They're exploiting something called social cognition. And if that term's unfamiliar to you, social cognition are the heuristics that our mind uses to make sense of vast quantities of data in terms of in terms of these kind of general or group level heuristics. So stereotyping, generalization, the use of weak ties are all examples of the use of social cognition. And an important one that is really relied on a lot in social media is the ability to create apparent consensus and get people to invoke what's called the generalized other in anthropology. The generalized other is something that all of us, refer to and make use of when we want to justify our actions or justify what others are doing. Because the generalized other is the they, and well, everyone knows. Well, who is everyone? It's the generalized other. It's something we make up in our mind, but we can create the impression of it by the messages we send. There are, of course, a lot of tools that are used also in terms of trying to spread these comments in social media. Of course, people use memes. Increasingly, memes are used in this space, particularly in the more political space. Bots are used, cyborgs, which are accounts that are sometimes run by a completely automated system or a bot, and sometimes by a human. Trolls, which are humans hiding under a pseudonym, but always engage in causing online disruption, often through the use of hate speech against various different minority groups. Deep fakes are increasingly common, and again, those are often used against minority groups and often used in political contexts, and of doctored images and videos. But something that we always forget is that a key element are subconscious cues. That is, the way in which the message is written itself or an image is taken or presented contain a lot of subliminal cues that actually influence the reader. Examples are the use of all capitals makes you think that, oh, that person's angry or upset at me. Or the use of a cute fuzzy picture of a kitten makes you think, oh, isn't that sweet? And you download it and all of a sudden you get malware on your system. These subliminal cues are very important. And all of these factors come into play in what's going on in social media. So let's first talk about extremism. So my group has actually worked on extremism for decades. And among some of the findings and some of the things we have is that disinformation, often in terms of images, are used to recruit members of extremist groups. They're also used to create group origin stories about why that group is the way it is. We also find that online messaging is actually used as a way to train one extremist group to train another, and is used by extremist groups to actually, in a copycat fashion, to claim that they are really part of a larger extremist movement. We also found that extremists are from all walks of life. They're from all ages. They're from all, they can be men or women. They can be any race, etc. And that many extremist groups, not all of them, importantly, not all of them, are also associated with conspiracy theories. And that those that are associated with conspiracy theories can be engaged in violent action if, in fact, the conspiracy theory is one that is being threatened by whatever is going on. So an example of a conspiracy theory would be, of course, the Flat Earth Society, and that is a group of extremists as well. But that one is not particularly threatening. A more important conspiracy theory that actually had some extremism around them as well, that was actually violent, were ones about the New World Order and how the Democrats and the rich people were taking over the world through COVID and by making us all go cashless, etc. One of the things our group has done is that we're involved working with some other groups in actually developing an extremism detector. And this system is actually utilizing both text information as well as who are they talking to identify at least extremist language, and then to identify that extremist language that occurs and its relationship to actual extremist-based events, with a particular worry about trying to find what are called lone wolf events, when an extremist goes off and kills a bunch of people, seemingly unpremeditated. what we found is that some of the best signals in social media for signaling extremism are the use of violent language, the use of hate speech, the use of moral value speech, that is talking about sanctity or talking about caring or talking about loyalty. Self-oriented speech using more first-person pronouns, more emotional speech, talking about fear and anger, not just hate, creating a language that creates an us-them separation, and language that, of course, depersonalizes the target. When you see all of these kind of signals together, what we have found is that the posts with more of those present, that the individuals associated with them are, I can't guarantee always, but that those individuals are more associated with, or at least supportive of, various extremist events. And separating those two is where we're at right now. Can we tell the difference? The work on our other work on extremism online has actually helped us to find different communities. For example, when ISIS was at its heyday, we actually were able to find an ISIS groups online, as well as the Syrian-focused community that was supporting them. So, and what you're seeing here in this picture is you're seeing what's called the ISIS community. Not all of those are members of ISIS. Many of them are part of the extremist supporting community, talking about them. But now let's talk about the role of bots and hate speech in this. Much of this work here was, much of the conversations here did not include hate speech. Some of it did, and some of it did when it came to when they were declaring jihad on various groups. But in addition to that, there was other kind of activity going on. For example, there's an imam in the top right group who kept sending out messages about what it meant to be a true member of their community. Okay, basically creating community. This group was parroting a lot of the same information, but mostly in English. And this group was saying similar things, but all in Arabic. The blue dots are ones that were suspended by Twitter for violating their supposedly for violating their terms of service, but they also were part of a list that was given them by Anonymous to actually remove extremists online. Most of them just went underground and then came back up into Twitter just a few days later. This thing up here is actually a bot. It's called the Fear Be Known bot. What that bot is doing is it's actually a whole set of accounts, a whole set of bots. They're all retweeting and talking to each other. And when you do that, you cause Twitter to notice and say, hey, that's a group. I got to pay attention to groups. Once Twitter started paying attention to that group, this Fear Be Known bot started retweeting messages by the imam I mentioned. That caused Twitter to say, oh, they're retweeting someone who's really popular. Therefore, I'm going to recommend them to all the followers of the imam. So now all his imam's followers all started getting not just the retweets of the imam by this bot, but also anything else that bot started to say. At that point, the bot started to send out notes about this particular site, which was a site for collecting money for the children of Syria, which is believed to have been a money laundering site for ISIS. So this kind of thing can be set up and done and is done by extremists online all the time. So now let's switch over a little bit to hate speech and see what the connection is there. Well, when we look at hate online, we're looking at both quantifying the hate narratives, we're looking at detecting hate speech and detecting how hate speech is manipulated and how those speaking in hate are manipulated, and then figuring out what the impact is in the online world. So we're going to start with, well, how do we discover what hate speech is? Well, there's many models out there of hate speech and many machine learning tools for finding it. The difference between what we've done here and what is typically done is that most of those are based on a training set, and they just say, well, humans coded it this way, so I'm going to create a machine that's coding this. we looked at that and said, well, that doesn't scale well. That doesn't let us work across languages, nor does it work with non-normative speech. So instead, what we did was we went out and we said, look, what does it mean to have hate speech? And based on the social science theory of what it means, it's a combination of abusive language, and it involves talking about things in terms of an identity. An identity is kind of a group or organization, but it's kind of at a generic level. So an example of an identity would be African American, an identity might be Muslim, etc. So what we're looking for are patterns that have both of these elements. We found the elements using the software that we've developed. We then built a model, and then we're actually able to identify hate speech, and then we compared it against known hate speech data. And we find that in general, we get over 80% accuracy. Now, that's not perfect accuracy, no way, but this operates in over 40 languages. And it's very, very rapid compared to many of the other things. Using this, and we've now improved it, so it's getting better accuracy now, we actually looked at hate speech across different cultures. And this is comparing, for example, what we're seeing in the United States and the Philippines. And what we find is that you see hate speech in both cultures, but that in the United States, the hate speech tended to be associated with anti-Asian and anti-Chinese sentiments at the time that we collected this data, whereas in the Philippines, the hate speech was associated with attacks against political leaders. The point is, we can now measure hate speech, and we can actually see what is the hate directed at. And what we see, as we've repeated this across many, many different cultures and countries, is that the volume of hate will go up and down dramatically, and who it's directed at will change based on particular events. So you will get more hate, for example, directed at political leaders as you near elections. But we've also can then look at the communities of haters, that is those espousing hate speech, and ask, what do they look like? What we find is that smaller size groups will exhibit on average more hate than will larger groups. That groups that are more isolated will also exhibit more hate, and that groups that are less dense, have less connections or less talking to each other, will also exhibit more hate, as will those that are more hierarchical. So we're starting to see a pattern emerge in terms of what it means to be a group online that espouses hate and what those groups look like, which is very important from a policy standpoint, but also in terms of identifying interventions. Now let's look at inauthentic actors. Inauthentic actors, as I mentioned, include things like bots, cyborgs, trolls, and deepfakes. Well, bots can act as amplifiers, just simply respouting messages, or they can be brokers, that is, they can bridge links between two groups. When we look at the spread of disinformation, we find that bots are not the source of disinformation, but that they actually sometimes will surround those who are spreading disinformation and will amplify it. We find that in fact, there's these things that we often refer to as fake news sites that will have little armies of bots around them, just simply amplifying the messages. We also find them as around many state-sponsored media, specifically Russia and China. So now if we look at the type of disinformation in general, more people spread disinformation than non-disinformation. But overall, there'll be about 20% of the information spread in social media on Twitter is being spread by bots. About 40% of the disinformation is being spread by bots. But if you look at that is really diabolical, and that actually also contains extremism talk or hate speech talk, such as that linking to things like bioweapons or conspiracy theories. Of that, over 60% of it is being spread by bots. So bots are being used very strategically, and they're being used very strategically at this critical point. Now, here's an example of a bot just to show you. And there's this actually real human who's a critic of China and the Chinese Communist Party called CT Lau. And he actually promotes a lot of things that have to do with the US and so on. What you're seeing on the right here is actually a bot. The left is the real CTLAO, on the right is the bot. And this bot was set up, it surrounds and sits around the Chinese state-sponsored media, and it sends out often very extremist language, but it will send out messages that are anti the US, and it will repeat anything that is coming out of the Chinese state-sponsored media that is anti-US, and builds up this kind of anti-US rhetoric. So in the disinformation playground, we've got state-sponsored media, we've got fake news sites, we've got people spreading stuff from that, but bots are sitting there amplifying those. Same thing for YouTube and so on. Then it gets to people and people take over, okay? Bots get it into the system and then people just take over and spread it. So now let's look at this with respect to malicious content and so on. So remember I mentioned trolls. Trolls were humans spreading information and causing disruption. So if we actually look at trolls versus bots, right? It turns out that trolls will often use hate speech. They're often the source of hate messaging, but bots are being used to amplify the messages by the trolls. And bots are being used to message haters such that they get recommended to each other and therefore build communities of haters. And bots are being used to bridge, to bring disinformation into these hate communities in order to increase their anger, to increase their fear, and sometimes therefore turn them actually into an extremist community. So bots act in this kind of middling way. So we've actually developed this system called the BEN framework, which looks at who is doing what to whom with what impact. And we've been operationalizing every step along this in order to understand these kind of online influence campaigns. We developed from this, we have found 8 different maneuvers that are used to in the social media space to affect what narrative is, what people are talking about. Here's an example of 2 of those: excite and distort. These are both using disinformation. The one on the left showing Ina Garten drinking a bleach cocktail, which I guarantee she did not do, was used to excite people and get them to kind of one of these echo chambers to get them to respond, to actually go out and engage in protests. The one on the right is a distort campaign. This one, all they did was they simply put a questioning face, and that actually caused distortion, which also turned out to be part of a campaign to increase fear in this one group and turn them to become much more extremist. We've also found 8 maneuvers such as backbuild, bridge and boost, neutralize, nuke, narrow, and neglect, which are designed to affect who is talking to whom on social media. These are equally important to the narrative campaigns that I mentioned. For example, what you're seeing on the left is a bridge campaign that occurred in Pennsylvania, where they're actually, what they're doing by sending pictures around like this is they're taking people who are out there to legitimately protest the lockdown, okay, because they were running out of money and they didn't have it. And they built links between them and these people who were joining the protest, not because they cared about the money, but because they wanted to incite fear that the lockdown was going to cause people to lose their rights. And so the way for protest. We also see on the right, you see a neutralization campaign, which is where they're just suspending things. Often the result of groups like Anonymous and others is actually to get accounts suspended, which is part of their neutralization chance. So what we find is that access to disinformation is not sufficient for a successful influence campaign, but rather you also need to cause behavioral changes. You need to create some kind of change in hate, change in topic, or something else. And the question is, can you do this in the short term, or can you also do it in the long term? So what we looked at was a bunch of people who had access to disinformation and looked at it over time. And what we find is that simply accessing it in the short term has a small impact and will lead to a slight increase in hate, slight changes in topic, and so on. But in the long term, the only change that's significant is who you are talking to and who those people who access the disinformation we're talking to. So in that sense, access to disinformation is important because it is dramatically reshaping the network. And because of that, it is dramatically allowing new groups to form and echo chambers to form. So here's an example of a successful influence campaign. On the left here, you're seeing the before picture. You've got a group of people who are more or less talking to each other. You've got a set of topics they're talking about that are more or less connected. And those people are more or less talking about the same topics, just like in a normal conversation. After one of these things and using disinformation, what happens is that group becomes highly connected to each other. The topics become much more connected to each other, and there's even a central focal topic. And the group itself is now focused in and tightly talking on that focused topic. They have become more of an echo chamber. And in fact, we see this happening all across the board. We've seen this now repeated in many, many different countries and so on, as part of what's called the polarization campaigns. Polarization campaigns, and you pick any issue you want, pro and anti-gun control, pro and anti-vax, pro and anti, pick your, whatever your topic of the week is. And what you will see is that you will see that bots, trolls, and cyborgs are joining both the pro and the anti side. Both of them is very important. Boost them up, makes these groups much more echo chambery like. Wait for an excite or dismay message to occur in one of them, and then cause the opposite message to appear in the other group, so that both groups have now been toppled over into this amygdala hijack mode. Then they start backing the opinion leader in both group and engaging in more discussion, making the group feel like there's forensics. And in fact, if they do this right before the timing of the protest, at this point is where they would then say, and by the way, go here for a protest, or by the way, go here for doing something. This was actually used in the anti-lockdown protests that occurred back last year in April. Okay, many of which were spurred on through the Trump's use of the liberate tweet that he sent out. So what's happened here is that multiple of these different influence maneuvers were used together. Back, boost, and dismay were all used together to first back these groups, to appear to be backing the opinion leaders in both groups, such as the governors who were saying, don't protest, we're going to stay on lockdown for a while, as well as to back those who are saying, we're getting killed here by being locked down. And then they boosted those groups up, and then they would spread things like dismay. So they actually did this in terms of growing protests. Notice it looks just like a polarization campaign, except what is the anti side doing? The anti is boosting it up, getting it better, but then they're sending out a lot of distort messages, getting the group more and more confused. Whereas over here, they're getting them to clear, they're boosting it up, they're becoming an echo chamber, and then they're exciting them by sending out dismaying messages. And then they get them to go to where the campaigns are, to where the protests are being held. One of the things that underlie this, clearly disinformation underlied it, but another thing that underlay all this was the role of hate speech. Disinformation was used to foster hate originally in the early days of COVID. And what you're seeing here is all the little red dots are those espousing hate speech, yellow are still espousing abusive speech, and blue is just everybody else. Disinformation was sent, such as, you can get COVID by eating bat wings, and that kind of stuff was out here. Then bots were used to get the individuals who were speaking with hate and link them together, like introducing them to each other basically online. And then it was used to actually grow the communities of haters. And at that point, those communities were now ripe and able to be changed, and their topic of hate changed. And you actually saw efforts being made to switch them from hating Chinese or hating cruise ships, actually hating scientists. So in the US, what we saw happen is that we had a lot of hate speech going up. It was often more about race and nationality than it is about anything else. And that much of the hate speech that's occurring is not from bots, but bots are being used to amplify it and to bridge the groups speaking hate. I mentioned that with the group that you just saw that was linked together, they started making that against scientists, but that wasn't all that was done. They also added a whole bunch of new accounts that were set up, and they started sending out attacks against expert advisors or scientists, and bots were used to actually keep the dialogue against science, meaning they would retweet anything that would come out that was anti-science. If we look at that in terms of those open protests, there was a whole bunch of new accounts that were set up. Many of the new accounts were of course, pro-protest, but there were also, importantly, a bunch that were set up that were against the protests. The difference was that on the pro-protest side, they're all linked together. On the anti-protest side, they're not all linked together. On the pro-protest side, they're focusing on hate toward science. On the anti-protest side, they're focusing on sowing confusion, distortion, and getting the group to not work together. Bots definitely dominated the discussion and led this to be happening. There were also several conspiracy theories that were used as part of this, including that COVID-19 itself was a hoax, that hospitals are empty and not overwhelmed, et cetera, and so on. Around each of these conspiracy theories, you'll see lots of extremism type talk. And you will see that as those got larger and started coming out in the protests, that extremism talk would get stronger. By the time the protests occurred, what you saw was that you had very big differences between the pro-protest and the anti-protest group. The pro-protest group had taken these people, which some of these individuals had like legitimate concerns about being locked down, but they had linked them to other groups that were part of these extremist groups. And so now you had they became more centralized, very consistent. They were very focused on things like MAGA, QAnon, et cetera. They were reading different kinds of news sources than was the anti-protest group. The anti-protest group was very diffuse, had lots of verified actors, had some real news agencies as part of it, but they just weren't, or it wasn't organized, nor was it very consistent in the storytelling that was going on. On the pro-protest side, there was more hate speech and more extremist talk. On the anti-protest side, there was less, not none, but less, particularly on the hate speech side. Hate speech itself does not lead to violence in the societies that we're seeing. In Pennsylvania, by the time it got to Pennsylvania, you saw small businesses and people concerned about the economy and the loss of jobs were all of a sudden being linked to and shown in conjunction with, or tweets were being sent that implied they were part of kind of these new groups. You saw lots of new flags appearing, lots more discussion about the Bill Gates conspiracy, et cetera. And of course, there were protests against the governor. The important thing that happened at this point was a rhetorical shift. And the rhetorical shift is as or more important than the fact that there was hate speech and extremism in the conversation, because the rhetorical shift changed the dialogue from, we're broke, we need money, et cetera, to changing the conversation to my rights are being violated. And because they started talking about rights, which is a very, very powerful rhetorical move, now all of a sudden you had a voice for why the individuals who were speaking with hate would all of a sudden have more fear induced in them. And they, oh, my rights are being violated. Well, everything's being taken away from me. And that you could prey on that fear to actually get them to join these extremist groups. And when we looked at it in terms of our topic-oriented community, this is one around Governor Wolf. The thing I want to point out is that all these big dots are bots. They all infiltrated this network. Initially, they all acted as though they were supporting Wolf. But then eventually, as you got nearer to the time of the protests, they started to actually explain that Wolf himself was a problem. And they tried to excite people to go engage in the protests and to do what their colleagues in Michigan and Minnesota and other places had done, and actually link these people to other people from other parts of the country. By the time you fast forward to January 6th, all of which this was, I would argue, was a lead up to January 6th, you now had this coordination going in spades on multiple platforms. And we found similar coordinated narratives occurring in Parler and on Twitter. We found cross linkage between those on Parler engaged in some of this discussion with those who were on Twitter. And some of the same people were in both platforms, and in both cases were espousing extremist behavior. So you had people purposely moving people into different online platforms, taking with them their messages. They coordinated both in terms of in terms of the timing of doing various things. They coordinated in terms of the topics. All those little things that look like snakes are evidence of coordination. And they're coordinated in terms of mentioning each other and doing shared mentioning. Now, let's go to the French terror attacks, which we often forget about. I want to point out that there were these terror attacks in France that were actually spurred on by Erdogan suggesting that they had to boycott all things French. And we actually looked at all of this data to see if we could actually find the extremists in this group, because we actually knew we could find it and so on. What we actually found were a number of individuals tweeting jihad. Some, but not all, used hate speech, and some others using hate speech were talking about things other than jihad. But within this, we actually were able to identify a series of important messages. And then we were able to, from that, to find those individuals who were actually engaged in coordinating the messages between the between the jihad, then the boycott thing, such as Ake, I am Aisha, and Once Says. And those individuals have extremely high extremism language, have a high hate speech, and they're tweeting about, and they tweet about jihad. We then can look at what they're doing, and we see that they are targeting different individuals. Mostly they're targeting the pro-jihad community and trying to activate them. Whereas the one group, Once Says, is actually trying to build bridges to the pro-jihad community from other groups to actually bring them into the argument. Okay, so I've showed you and talked about a lot of things. This area has been recognized by the National Academies as an area called social cybersecurity, which is focused on online harms, both the science and the engineering. It's about hacking people, capturing their hearts and minds. There's many areas that the National Academies have recognized as being important for doing future research. I'd highly recommend anyone who wants to get involved. But I want to say that in terms of online nexus of harm, what have we learned? We've learned that bots are used to collect haters into hate groups, that they are not the source of hate, and they are not the source of extremism. We found that small amounts of disinformation are used to focus hate and to redirect it to new targets, such as switching it from hate against Chinese to hate against scientists for a short period of time. We found that disinformation is used to provide extremists with a story that can help them support and bring others into their fold. And that we find that not all extremist groups are hate groups, and not all hate groups are extremists. We found that bots and trolls are also useful to increase echo chamberness of groups, and that echo chambers can be toppled into offline activity using a dismay or excite maneuver, but that is a short-term effect. But it is when that occurs that you are most likely to see violence occurring in the real world. One of the things we want to look at next is if extremist group is also a hate group and it is toppled, does that occur fast enough, and can you detect it online fast enough to see if it will actually predict that there will be a hate-based incident? With that, I will close and answer questions.
Thank you, Kathleen. That was extremely interesting. Do you want to stop sharing your screen and we can get you back?
Yeah, let me do that. Sure.
So people feel free to put questions in the chat, but let me start. There's so much in there, I'm not even sure where to begin, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on one issue. So you make a really good argument for how the echo chambers work and how they work over time. So the echo chambers are always kind of reinforcing the same messages or pulling in adjacent messages, right? So could you talk a little bit about two things that seem to be incompatible with the dynamics of echo chambers? One is, how do we get from echo chambers, which are basically always saying that what we're concerned about is the big concern, right? So if you're in QAnon, it's child trafficking, whatever. So how do online communities move from that echo chamber to link to other echo chambers with non-adjacent issues? In other words, how do we get from echo chambers worried about child trafficking merging with echo chambers worried about corporate control of vaccinations, merging with echo chambers concerned about, supporting the far right in France? I mean, those, so,
Yeah.
how do echo chambers seems like they would constantly move inward, but they seem to constantly move inward and be able to create links. And the other question I have is, and I'm seeing this right now with regard to how far right virtual communities are reacting to the situation in the war in Ukraine. And that, so it starts out, there's kind of a homogeneous thought about this, which is like Russia is right. Well, it actually starts out maybe Ukraine is right because some of these people fought with neo-Nazis in Ukraine in 2014. Then it shifts to, no, Russia is completely right because Putin is the great white hero. And now it's kind of shifting back again. So how do shifts happen? Sort of how do ideological shifts happen when it seems like they would always be reinforcing the same message and kind of expelling different messages? Just like, I'm just interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, so the first thing is that the echo chambers that we've seen become focused on the topic, but that topic can shift subtly. So it can shift, right? And each topic is not like a single sentence. It's like a storyline, right? So one of the ways in which you can link these different groups together, and that we actually saw happening in one case, was that they each had their own storyline, but in each of those storylines, they had a diffuse set of enemies who were causing problems, right? And to link them together, what they did was they said they gave them a common enemy. They created a new element to all the storylines that says, and the real culprit is blah. And so they linked them together in that case, by giving them a common enemy. So if you can weave a large, and one of the things about the New World Order conspiracy is it's so elaborate, but it actually linked together a whole bunch of these different groups because it wove each of their concerns into a common overarching picture, going from Bill Gates to RFID tags being in your body when you get vaccinated. So that was one part of it. The second thing is, how did they shift pro and con? I will say that we don't have a good answer there, but it's not clear to me that they actually ever really shifted, because there's multiple people in them, and some of them might think view, but not everyone, right? So that's one part. The second thing is the gut reaction to Ukraine. Oh, this is terrible, it's horrible. It was a gut reaction, but it wasn't sustained. It was an emotional response by seeing pictures of dead children in Ukraine. And so an emotional response is not long. So then they went right back to their old mantra, because that for them is no longer emotional.
Thank you. Let me just say the questions for the people who are watching on YouTube. First question is, does your group also research mitigation techniques?
We are starting to. We have a couple of new projects looking at mitigation. One of the best things, of course, is to build is actually not so much mitigation as what do you do ahead of time, which is build group resilience by getting people to have greater social media literacy.
Another question that thanks for the presentation. I was wondering if your group's research has detected any changes in bot behavior to become more, quote, human over time.
Oh, absolutely. Bots are getting increasingly more sophisticated and much more realistic, which is why bot detectors actually have to be continuously retrained. But it's also the case that the old style bots are still around as well.
So I have another question. To what extent can you develop techniques that identify real life leaders and how they're intervening in these discussions, in these to accelerate extremism or to drive extremism toward violence or offline behavior? Can you identify, locate intervention points where people are trying to drive the discussion in a particular way?
Well, if someone is an opinion leader within the group, you can get that drive because they're like shifting topic, or they're doing repeated topic and they start messaging it out multiple times and then it gets amplified. So you can, I would say that at this point, it's still one of those things that takes, takes a lot of tools and takes a lot of effort to do. You can't just do it and I know within 10 minutes by running some simple algorithm. And you actually have to know what the group is. So it's doable, but hard.
So let me ask you the hard question. Where does this all go? I mean, we're moving toward essentially an acceleration of both extremism and polarization in this. So could you project forward?
Well, at the same time, those things are, you can do them now at scale, which you couldn't do before. We also see movements that are the opposite, right? We're also seeing increasing number of movements online to try to get people to talk to each other. We're also seeing increasing, kind of, I would call them, they're still extremists, but now they're extremists for good, right? Or for at least not causing social harms. So I think we're just going to enter a new status quo for a while where, you get a balance between these different forces. I don't think the extremist side, the hate speech side will win, is going to take over everything. But I also think that, the side that's against it is also not going to take over everything, but we'll reach a new plateau kind of.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, are you familiar with Audrey Tang's work in Taiwan regarding social media literacy education for children? And do you think there's a chance here in the US?
I don't know Audrey Tang's work specifically. I do know that there's work by some of our colleagues at RAND and other places and many other groups in the US who are actually working on social media literacy for children as well. So, and do I think those things will have success? The answer is yes, I do, because we've actually seen some impacts, positive impacts of that. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, let me, we'll conclude here. Thank you so much, Kathleen. That was an incredibly informative presentation. I learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody else did. And we really appreciate your work and the work of your research group in this area.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks for coming.